Hello, author James L. Nunn here, back with another writing tips video. So recently I had been asked the question about my process for outlining a story. Basically how I take it from like that basic plot synopsis summary stage and then stretch it out into an outline, basically creating the kind of structure of the story with which to then go in and fill in the scenes and dialogue and bits like that. So I thought I would do a video in here kind of explaining the process, explaining kind of how I go about outlining a story, basically, or outlining a project whenever I'm working on one. What I'll do first, I think I'm going to break this up into a couple parts. So the first thing is I'll give you the basic rundown, just the quick kind of answer, and then maybe go into a bit more detail and maybe even show you guys an example of that, like a quick, just made up example of the process. So I am and you can't start any kind of writing, author, any kind of tips video without a good cup of tea. Basically, my process for outlining, the way I start is with that initial synopsis or plot story idea. I take the plot synopsis, whatever that initial, almost like the summary that you would read on the back of the book, whatever the overall idea. You got to have your beginning and your end, right? Point A and point B. And the goal is to stretch it out so that point A and point B have some legs in the middle to make it into a story. I take the basic plot synopsis or summary, and then I will write out however many chapters I think I'll need. Usually it gets, either I'll have to add chapters, remove chapters. Some chapters that I think is only going to be one, when I get to writing it, will turn into two. But basically, for instance, one of the books that I'm working on right now, one of the projects, I just wrote out chapter 1, chapter 2, all the way up to like chapter 20, I think, or chapter 22 or something. And what ended up happening is then I go and for chapter 1, so you take that plot synopsis, that summary, and you go to chapter 1 and you say, okay, what needs to happen in chapter 1? Normally this is like your introduction to the main character, your introduction to the story or the setting. It's chapter 1 typically, obviously not in every case, but typically is like a introductory chapter. So I'll write on my outline, I'll write chapter 1. We meet so-and-so's character, we get a little backstory into their life, and a little bit of a setup for getting the ball rolling, so to speak, on the story. Sometimes, chapter 1 may be as simple as meet this person and figure out what situation they're in. Or maybe chapter 1 may be like if you're telling the story in like flashback sequence, or you want to start off with a big action scene, you can start off like right in the middle of an action scene, kind of that happens later on, without giving too much spoilers away. So chapter 1 will be like, that you're really gripping the audience, and then chapter 2 and 3 you'll flash back and figure out how they led up to that point. And then like chapter 4, then you get this so-and-so is going to do this thing, and this will happen to progress them to the next chapter, and so on and so forth, so that each chapter something is happening. And basically, again, you're not writing the whole chapter out. You don't have to write. For me, at least for me, it's just a basic like 1 or 2 sentence, maybe a 1 or 2 like paragraph. It's almost like taking the whole story summary and then breaking it down into little summaries of each chapter. I'm taking that, and for each chapter I'm giving a little summary for what's going to happen within that chapter. And so that way, then when I'm on that chapter, say I'm on chapter 3 or 4 and I don't remember what's supposed to happen, well, I can look and see, oh, Larry, I wrote down for chapter 4, Larry goes to the post office, and this is when he finds out about his cousin Bob's coming to visit, and so Larry has to frantically run around and prepare his home for cousin Bob. So like that may be just what I put in the outline, and then when I get to chapter 3 I'll read that and I'll say, okay, so then you want to write down the actual scenes. I write down Larry's interactions and dialogue and his thoughts when he's at the post office, and then show him, writing is showing, right? Not telling. So you would then in the scene or the chapter show him the frantics and the kind of humor of the things of him rearranging his house, and then Bob shows up early or something, stuff like this, kind of to fill the scene, to actually flesh out the story. But everything comes down to that initial plot outline, which is the thing that I was asked about, specifically, was how do you take that basic plot synopsis and then stretch it out into an outline, a structure for a story, which you can then go in and add the dialogue and stuff into later. And that's basically the way I do it, is I just look at it as a chapter by chapter kind of structure. I just look at it one chapter at a time, think about what I want to happen in each of those chapters to stretch out that basic summary into a story. And so that way then I can go in and fill in each of those chapters with the actual details. So what I'll do is I'll show you guys an example here and show a quick example to kind of get your guys' thoughts on that. So okay, so here we have like basically just your basic average blank Google Docs. I use Google Docs for everything. So let's go here, we'll just type in outline for Jerry the Spider. There we go. So we're gonna do an outline for Jerry the Spider. Forgive my atrocious spelling. I always underline titles for some reason, and it helps. So we've got chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and we'll just do chapter 4 for fun here. So basically, first you want to go to your basic idea. This is like the initial idea that you came up with that makes you want to write a story anyways. If you're like me, a lot of times, I'll have a really crazy dream and I'm like, man, that would kind of make a good idea for a story or a book. I would really like to, flesh that out and see what I can do with that. So let's say Jerry is a happy spider who lives in a web on the web in the corner of a barn door. Jerry, after a big storm, Jerry is blown away from his home and must find his way back. So let's go from there. So for chapter 1, I would put, for the outline, get to meet Jerry the Spider, learn about his life on the farm, interacting with his animal friends as they enter and exit the barn. So there's that. Chapter 2 is going to be the night of the big storm. Jerry and the animals are frightened by the strength of the storm. A strong gust blows Jerry away. So then I'll go to chapter 3 and say Jerry awakes in an unfamiliar place, which we'll say is maybe he gets blown over into, let's see, be a fun place for him to have to travel back to the barn, but not too far, obviously, because these spiders are only going to travel so far. We want to make it obtainable. For the sake of this, we'll say he gets blown from the barn to the garden. Okay. He can see the distant structure of the barn and begins his journey back. And then we'll say chapter 4. Jerry encounters many adventures and obstacles on his trek home. And then chapter 5, Jerry at last reaches the barn and begins the long climb back to the corner. Once making it, he is aided, he is aided by his by his farm animal friends, and they all celebrate. We'll say, let's flesh this one out a little more, give a little more details. Has to cross a moat. Let's see. Has to cross a large lake, which is a puddle left by the rain. He has to hide in some rocks to avoid being eaten by a hungry bird above, and finally he must, what's another good one? Finally, to get back home, let's see here, let's get some thinking juice. That's what my tea is going to be today, is my thinking juice. And finally he must solve the riddle asked to him by Simon Snake in exchange for passage through his territory. Okay, so now we've taken Jerry is a happy spider, lives in a web, big storm, blown away from home, got to find his way back. That's our basic idea. That's, you know, we had a dream about, or we seen something that we thought would be a good idea. And then we take here and we had our chapters laid out, and then we give just a little bit of information about each of the chapters, what kind of things should happen. So then you'll go back, then in your actual story you'll write chapter 1 if you put a chapter title, and you'll say, on a bright sunny day in a happy farm, we today find ourselves learning about the story of Jerry the spider. Jerry was born, and then maybe have like a scene, you know, show Jerry waking up in a typical day in his life as a spider up in a barn, and some of the dialogue and interactions with him and some of his barn friends. And then you've got the big storm, and so then you're like, okay, well, I ended that one, you know, introducing everybody's happy. Then chapter 2, you come in and it's like, okay, so, you know, one particular night, the weather was extremely bad and it was really hard blowing, and the door was cracked just enough to the barn that Jerry ended up flying out, you know, you actually go into details, right? And you talk about the scenes of the animals being scared, and you talk about the details of the storm and the wind, and describe things, describe the night, describe their emotions and their feelings, and then you can go in and flesh it all out and go through each scene and dialogue more detail to complete and flesh out the story. And maybe again, those are things, other videos and topic videos that we can get back to, but for now that is basic kind of rundown A little more in detail example with my overextended probably explanations about my process for outlining and how I break down and kind of structure my plots for stories. So yeah, so I hope this helps. Like I said, I'm still a relatively new self-published indie author. I too am still learning my way and learning a lot of things, but for my process, this is just a peek into my process and stuff that I went through with my first published book and with the projects that I'm working on now. So that way, maybe if you are curious or if it helps, then that's just a little window into the behind the scenes there. I want to thank you guys so much for coming out. Be sure to check out my first published novel, self-published novel, over on Amazon and Audible, where it is available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. It's called The Princess and the Squire by Lee Zephyr. It's a great fun read, adventure, romance, knights and battle, and all kinds of fun stuff. And if you want to hear more about my process or have any questions yourselves that you'd like to hear me rabble on about or give examples of, be sure to let me know. See you guys next time.